tonight to bring back Mike Bonkowski. Due to popular demand, this is his third presentation in as many years with us. He began his first presentation with the E&N Railroad, followed by a survey of the passenger ships and ferries that served Nanaimo in 1961, or until 1961. As many of you here probably attended those meetings and saw that. Mike's bio: he's a lifelong Vancouver Islander whose interest in its built and environment and transportation history was piqued through family field trips and by his father's running commentary about this, that, and the why along the way. Mike is here tonight to tell us about the inspiration for and the origins of the BC Forest Discovery Centre, formerly called the BC Forest Museum for people that have lived around here for a few decades. And recently, Mike has begun a video and photographic record of the artifacts at that museum, and they'll help us gain a deeper understanding of their provenances moving along. Okay, with that, put your hands together for Mike.
Welcome familiar people, people I haven't met yet. So, start of the talk, that's our cover shot. We'll talk about that in a bit. Hey, who's that guy? So, who am I? Well, as Daryl mentioned, I'm interested in history, especially BC transportation infrastructure, and I enjoy videos and photos. That's what I do for a hobby, and my nickname for that on things like YouTube is Low Light Mike. That's because I used to do a lot of low light photography. I thought that was a clever name, maybe. Now the photos that I'm going to show are mainly my own from the past 4 years, plus some from the BC Forest Discovery Centre archives from the 1950s and 60s. And I'll explain the relevance of each photo as I get to it, although not always immediately. So don't worry, at some point I will say, and that's what this photo is. So the talk title, I tried to be clever, and there's BC Forest Discovery Centre, the history of a place that preserves history. So the centre is located in the municipality of North Cowichan. Now that's just north of the city of Duncan, although lots of people just refer to the general area as Duncan. It's the corner of Highway 1 and Drinkwater Road, or across the highway from Walmart. Now this photo shows a typical scene of the grounds with a look at the logging camp area and a locomotive shed. And I kind of think that if you were a kid growing up in a logging camp, say at Was or Kaikus or someplace on the island or Nanaimo River, perhaps this is what your neighborhood looked like, with bunkhouses and just stuff all around. Now, originally this place was branded as a forest museum, currently branded Forest Discovery Centre, and I'm going to use both terms interchangeably, and there's no rhyme or reason for it. Sometimes it's easier to say forest museum. So, research sources, it's important to cite those. My primary one was a history essay called Origins, which was written by former board member David Williams back in 1989 for the 25th anniversary of their society. I also used a biography summary of Gerry Wellburn. We'll talk about him a lot this evening, written by his son Vern. Then there's a book, From Farm to Museum by Dana Abima. And then various discussions with wonderful museum staff and volunteers, and my own experience being there in the past 4 years. And of course, I'm into railway research, so that helps. So I'm going to talk about the history of the site, the history of the artifacts, and how those two things came together into a forest museum. And I'll also talk about what the centre means to Vancouver Island. So let's get into it. Now, when a museum has existed for about 60 years, and again, about 60 years, but I'll talk a bit later about what's the starting point, how do you measure that? It was about 60 years, it becomes a historical artifact in its own right. The place that preserves history has a history of its own. And throughout this talk, I'm going to circle back to that point. So I'm going to start my talk with the stories and end my talk with the stories of two different steam locomotives at the Forest Discovery Centre. Now the stories are different, but they're both examples of what the Forest Discovery Centre is. Story number 1 is about locomotive number 25, affectionately known by multiple generations as Samson. Now, the number 25 locomotive has been at the Forest Discovery Center since day 1. And in fact, it was one of the first locomotives at the predecessor location, and I'll talk about that in a bit. It's spent close to 60 years at the Forest Discovery Center. 47 of those years spent pulling the visitor train, as shown in this photo. 47. The other 13 years were out of service, usually with expired certificates, which required major work on the boiler. That happens with steam locomotives. And it's currently in another one of those out of service periods, and this photo from 2024 on the right-hand side is it in the storage shed. And there's a replica speeder of a typical cruise speeder that used to be in places like Copper Canyon and places like that. So the number 25 locomotive was built in 1910 by a company called Vulcan Iron Works in Pennsylvania, so we call it a Vulcan locomotive. And it was purchased by a construction company in Washington State. Are you guys okay with the microphone? Yeah, okay, good. 1920, it was brought to the BC mainland to work for a construction company doing work on BC interior railway construction, but just for a few years. And then it sat in a shed in North Vancouver for close to 30 years until it was rescued from a likely scrapping fate and brought to Vancouver Island for preservation. That's going to be a common theme throughout this talk. Now, it never worked anywhere in the forest industry and never worked in any industry on Vancouver Island. And yet, it resides in a forest industry museum, and it has the affection of multiple generations of people on Vancouver Island. And it got dressed up on certain days to celebrate its birthday, as seen in this 2023 photo. Or a birthday cake every year on Labor Day to celebrate the birthday of the locomotive. So why is this? And I pondered this as my sort of opening question. Now, perhaps it's the continued presence and visitor experience that results in an artifact becoming a much-loved part of the museum, despite being outside of their core theme of forestry. I mean, it's as big a part of the museum as are the forestry artifacts from nearby logging camp locations. So I think, and people that have been involved in museums, that this is the power of visitor familiarity, reinforced over many years and multiple generations. So now let's get into the timeline. How did the forest industry get to be? So it starts with Gerry Wellburn, seen here in 1976 with his number 25 locomotive Samson. He was born in 1900 in Yorkshire, England, so it makes it really easy to calculate his age as we go through his timeline. His childhood hobbies were, of course, the normal things: trains, history, and stamp collecting. And in 1911, the family immigrated to Victoria, BC. In 1928, as a perhaps 28-year-old, he started Wellburn Timbers, a business near Duncan. But this was bad timing because the Great Depression started the next year, and that interrupted his business. But in 1934, he built a large sawmill near Deerholm, southwest of Duncan. And in 1945, he sold his company to a fellow named H.R. McMillan. And then he became a manager for a McMillan operation at Shawnigan Lake. And in 1963, he retired from that. Okay, so we've got a retired guy who's into trains and collecting, and who's worked for years in the South Island forest industry. So can you maybe see where this story just might be headed? Gerry and his wife Ethel May were avid collectors of historical artifacts, particularly railway and logging equipment. This photo is from 1959 at Gerry's home property with a steam-powered tractor. So here's a quote from their son Vern Wellburn, and this tells you this is the key bit of history. The early 1950s were a period of great change in BC. It was out with the old and in with the new. Now, because of the Great Depression, followed by the war, companies during those years could not afford to buy new equipment, or it was not available. So in 1950, many companies were still operating obsolete 1920s machines. And this was particularly true in the forest industry. So the 1950s decade was conversion both from rail to truck and steam to diesel. And the scrap dealers had a bonanza. I'm still quoting his son here. When Gerry saw his beloved locomotives being broken up, he became alarmed. "We are throwing away our heritage," he said. So he started to collect everything. Logging equipment, locomotives, trucks, buggies, farm tractors, fire engines, you name it. In 1955, he purchased a narrow gauge steam locomotive from North Vancouver, and he built a railway to run it on. This is the number 25 that he nicknamed Samson. Now his collection and a narrow gauge operating railway were at his 12-acre home property in Deerholm, southwest of Duncan. Now, if you've heard this story before and you're familiar with it, you're like, okay, this is interesting, I know this. But if this is your first time hearing this story, it's a bit remarkable. On his home property, a narrow gauge operating railway and a collection of artifacts. And it attracted a lot of visitors. So the railway was officially named Glenora and Western Railway for regulatory purposes, but informally it was known as Grandpa's Railroad. So this photo is from Grandpa's Railroad in the 1950s with the number 25 Samson. Okay, this is a good time to explain railway gauge, perhaps the most technical part of tonight's talk. Okay, it's going to be relevant when we talk about some locomotives. So his home railway and the BC Forest Discovery Centre's current visitor train railway is narrow gauge. That means 3 feet between the two rails, so a 3-foot width. But standard gauge in North America is wider at 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails, and that's what almost every railway uses today. But narrow gauge was popular for logging and mining in the early years of industry because they could handle tighter curves, simpler to build, they used less space, and not as wide of a grade to cut or fill, especially on a curve. And to convert a locomotive from standard to narrow, or vice versa, was a complicated long-term project, but it could be done. Back to Gerry's story. To quote Vern again, by 1963, Grandpa's railroad was out of control. He had a mile of track and a city of storage sheds on his 12-acre property. It was a private collection, and they did not have the facilities to service the 100 or more visitors who would show up on a weekend. This photo shows the number 24 with those lovely circular windows in the cab, pulling the passenger car at Gerry's home property. So this popularity became a burden to the Wellburn family, and Gerry saw that his only solution was to dispose of his collection, and he chose Greater Victoria. Now, another question, why? Why Victoria? Now, perhaps he was overwhelmed at what the popularity of his collection had become, and he had a longtime friend who was a deputy minister in the provincial government. So, perhaps this was the only path he could envision towards a solution. Now, various concerned Cowichan Valley people tried to persuade him that no, the collection should remain in the Cowichan Valley because of the Cowichan Valley's history of forestry. But nonetheless, Gerry proceeded with what he saw as his only way out. And in late 1963, he made an arrangement with the province of BC to transfer his entire collection to a site near Beaver Lake on the Saanich Peninsula into the care of the province. Now, the concerned Cowichan group suddenly had 3 immediate challenges. Number 1, convinced Gerry Wellburn to instead leave his collection to a Cowichan Valley group. Number 2, to persuade the BC provincial government to void its agreement with Mr. Wellburn regarding Saanich. And number 3, of course, to find a suitable site in the Cowichan Valley for the collection. Now, spoiler alert, I mean, you've already seen photos of the site, and some of you have already visited there, and some of you work there, so you kind of already know the outcome of all this, but this describes how it happens. So I'm going to describe this 1964 timeline. And like historians sometimes say, it's neat when history is described in days, not months and not years, but days. It moves quickly. So it's early February 1964. Guitar music is playing next door. Lovely. Early February 1964. But that's the same month when the Beatles landed in New York City and appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. But over in Vancouver Island, a guy named George Evans of the Concerned Cowichan Group found a 15-acre property on Drinkwater Road in North Cowichan, and he got an option to purchase it. Now this land is still part of the center today. It's near where the locomotive shops and Foresters Walk are, and this is the Roger Davies mink farm. Now, fun fact, a grandson from that mink farm family is a longtime locomotive engineer at the Forest Discovery Center, and he continues to run steam locomotives there in 2024. That connection is neat. So this photo shows Mr. McMillan, H.R. McMillan, in the white shirt, and Gerry Wellburn and others at the new site. And Gerry agreed to keep his collection in the Cowichan Valley if a suitable arrangement could be made. Now we go day by day. February 19th, the provincial government agreed to not hold to Gerry's 1963 Saanich transfer agreement. In other words, they would not prevent a Cowichan group from keeping the collection in the Cowichan Valley. Next day, February 20th, first organizational meeting of what would become the Society. Now the attendance list gives an idea of community involvement. We got the mayor of Duncan, the reeve of North Cowichan, I looked this up, reeve, head of a village or a town council, synonymous with mayor, but usually for a smaller town. We had the editor of the Cowichan Leader newspaper, we had a lawyer, the fellow who wrote the Origins essay, and various other business people, and of course Gerry Wellburn himself. The key decisions at that first meeting, number one, to purchase that 15-acre Drinkwater Road property immediately as a place to establish the museum, and number two, to incorporate a society to own and operate the museum. Next day, February 21st, guess what happened? They got a loan advance from the Bank of Montreal to allow for the property purchase. And they started drafting the society's constitution and bylaws. Next day, February 22nd, I don't know what happened that day. There's nothing mentioned in that. Perhaps it was a day of rest. February 23rd, Jim McFarlane of McMillan Bloedel began volunteer work laying out the design and the route of the visitor train railway. That'd be the narrow gauge Cowichan Valley Railway, that's the official name. The work included engineering calculations necessary to meet government regulations for a railway in BC. And this photo shows people building the track in 1964. Now the resulting visitor train railway today is a good example of what a logging railway on Vancouver Island was like in the first half of the 20th century. We've got tight curves, steep grades, through meadow and forest, and a trestle. Now I was recently at the forest part of that track with a fellow named Ken and the author Robert Turner. And Robert Turner commented more than once that the forest portion of the track is a good example of what Gerry Wellburn had envisioned, which is for the Forest Museum to be in a forest. And the 1964 design route includes a small bend so that a large tree could be kept. And Robert Turner mentioned that that design was very typical of Gerry and his wishes to keep the big trees, even if that meant a more twisty train route. February 24th, Gerry Wellburn and Hector Stone from Hillcrest Lumber visited Vancouver to meet with various forest industry people and foundations to get donations. February 25th, Gerry informed the provincial government that yes, the Cowichan Valley plan would indeed go ahead. February 26th, Constitution and bylaws were finalized. That's 5 days after they were started. That's amazing. The purpose of the society, this is the Constitution, was to acquire and operate a public museum preserving the historical logging equipment and artifacts collected by Gerry Wellburn. And the Cowichan Valley Forest Museum Society was incorporated on March 2nd, 1964. Now in spring 1964, work continued to construct the narrow gauge Cowichan Valley Railway with lots of help from the track crew of Hillcrest Lumber at Missachi Lake. That's what you see in the photo. And throughout the remainder of 64 and into 65, work continued building the railway and overall site. Now, the Wellburn collection was moved to that new site during 65 and into 1966 even, and there were lots of items. Now, for the collection, this was a sale, not a donation, but the price was a modest $50,000, and it wasn't fully paid until 1972. So easy, simple terms, but it was a sale. May 24th, 1965, we had the soft opening of the Forest Museum to the public. Now, the official opening ceremony was over a year later, but this was the actual opening, and they had 17,000 paid visitors in that first year, 1965. But then we get to 1966, and the official opening happened June 4th. Now, this photo is the ticket for the official opening. You'll note the logo on the bottom right-hand corner for you historians out there. The date was set to coincide with that 1966 100th anniversary year of the 1866 joining of the two Crown colonies. Crown Colony of British Columbia and Crown Colony of Vancouver Island. That was a big deal probably in 1966. Lots of cool things happened that year. Inside joke there. I note that official openings are often months or a year after the actual opening, and dates become problematic for the historian. Some of you have experienced this. For this case, how do you measure the anniversary date of the organization? By the society incorporation date? Or by the soft opening date? Or by the official opening date? And it doesn't really matter. I think consistency throughout a book or presentation is what matters, but I digress. Back to the story of the property site acquisitions. We've talked about the 15-acre former mink farm, but then between 64 and 72, there were various purchases of parcels of the Windire farm property. And those properties had been a working farm business since 1912. And the most visible part, for those that recall driving down the Trans-Canada Highway north of Duncan, was a farm stand on the side of the highway starting in the 1950s and going until the 1970s. And this photo is from the Windire farmland, seen in 2024 with a lovely interpretive sign. Now, in 1974, the entirety of the property and the artifact collection was conveyed to the Crown, meaning the province. Now, I think that during this era, that was a common way to have ownership of historical items to preserve and protect them for the public good. And they formed a new society for that in 74. Now, property designated by the province as a historic site is what happened. It's just similar to what has happened at Barkerville and Fort Steele. Next photo. Gerry. Gerry was the curator and manager at the Forest Museum as a volunteer until 1974, and then he died in 1992. 92 years old, approximately, depending on how the months and days fall. Present site of the Forest Museum, close to 100 acres, so they rounded up. Nice, easy number to remember. Approximately 15 building structures of all sorts, that's what I've read, and of course a 1.6-mile narrow gauge railway, plus some sidings and spur tracks, including a steep 9% switchback railway grade to get up to the locomotive shop, and that is quite the thing. Hey, one of my photos. Let's talk about artifacts. So, the story of the various artifacts tell the historical story of the forest industry in coastal BC. You learn about where an artifact is used, what companies operated it, and the impact that it had on workers and families. And of course, then there's the next life, the post-work history of the same artifact as a display or tourism item at the center. Now, for example, that cute little green locomotive in the foreground worked at James Island near Sydney for the CIL Explosive Company. Those of you in Nanaimo know that that company name is a subtle part of the Solaire neighborhood, which is why the Solaire subdivision has streets such as black powder. But we digress again. Let's take a look at this. Now, some of the artifact items that I'm going to describe now, these ones are from the Wellburn collection that are still on site at the Forest Discovery Center. So we'll start with the Shea steam locomotive. This is Blodell, Stewart and Welch No. 1, built in 1911. It's displayed outside near the front entrance at the corner of Highway 1 and Drinkwater Road, and there's a loaded log car displayed behind it. Now, both this type of locomotive and the company name, Blodell, Stewart, and Welch, speak to BC forest history. Now, my mother-in-law writes books on Powell River area history, and I often see mention of that Blodell, Stewart, and Welch name in her writings. So this Shay locomotive was ordered new by that company in 1911 for its Myrtle Point operation south of Powell River. And then this happened with many Blodell, Stewart, and Welch locomotives. It crossed the strait and started to work on Vancouver Island, at Menzies Bay, north of Campbell River, at Great Central Lake, and at Franklin River near Alberni. Now, by the time that Blodell, Stewart, and Welch amalgamated with H.R. McMillan's company in the early 1950s, this lovely number 1 locomotive was obsolete and destined to be scrapped. So it was Gerry to the rescue. And it was purchased by Gerry Wellburn, and he brought it to his Glenora home property because that's what you do. It's one of the first locomotives in this collection. But it didn't run on his grandpa's railroad because it's standard gauge and his railway was narrow gauge. And it's been the roadside fixture almost since day one. Here's a Vulcan steam locomotive. We've talked about it a bit already. Number 25, Samson, built in 1910. It worked Gerry's grandpa's railroad and the Forest Discovery Center's visitor train railway, and that photo is from a Christmas event in 2023. You got Samson, you must have Susie, the number 24, built in 1900, also one of the original locomotives that pulled the visitor train at Gerry's home property and at the Forest Discovery Center, but only until about the late 1980s. This photo shows Susie at Gerry's Deerholm property, again with those lovely circle windows in the cab. Worked for 38 years in southeastern BC in coal mining industry, but just like Samson, no forestry history and no Vancouver Island industrial history, but it was one of Gerry's rescues. And here she is in the shed in 2024. It could only pull 2 small passenger cars, so a smaller locomotive, less powerful, and currently has a retirement in the shed, which is both sad to see and interesting to see. This is a historical artifact, and you always think of what could be and what was, but that's the reality. Hey, something that's not a train. There it is, logging camp buildings from Copper Canyon Logging Camp. These came from Copper Canyon, west of Chemainus, and this was VL&M, Victoria Lumber and Manufacturing Company. That's the company that essentially built Chemainus and later became part of McMillan Blodell. Now, there's 4 buildings, but you're saying, but Mike, that looks like 5, and that's because the one on the right is actually just one overall building connected. It's 2 wings. Now there's different setups on the inside, including bunkhouse as shown in this photo, medical treatment, timekeeper, payroll, surveyor's office, and dining hall. There's a look at the dining hall. These structures are a popular set of buildings to walk into, connected by a nice boardwalk, and often in the summertime you'll have a docent on duty explaining the items in person. I love it when I get to use museum terminology. Okay, now to explain some of the artifacts that came directly to the Forest Museum and didn't go through Gerry's Glenora home property. Yes, there actually were some. So on the left side of this photo is another Shay steam locomotive, Hillcrest Lumber's number 1, built in 1920. Now that's the locomotive on the left, I said, and I'm going to talk about that later as my ending story. But on the right-hand side is another one hiding behind in the background. That's Mayo Lumber's number 3, built in 1924. It's a highly visible item on the upper grounds of the center near the logging camp buildings, and it's the large spark arrestor on top of its smokestack that's the defining feature. Now, as the name suggests, it worked for Mayo Lumber in the Cowichan Valley at Pauldee. So lots of industrial and cultural history at Pauldee. After its working days were done, it sat as a display locomotive at Pauldee until it was donated to the Forest Museum as a display item in 1967 in memory of pioneer lumberman Mayo Singh. No worries. It's standard gauge, so it doesn't fit the narrow gauge visitor track. Now, it was restored to operational status in 1995 at the Forest Museum by staff and volunteers, and then loaned to the Kettle Valley Steam Railway in Summerland, BC, for their startup of a tourism train. And it remained at Summerland working their train until after Summerland had received their own permanent locomotive that's still in use today. Then the Mayo number 3 was returned to the Forest Discovery Center, and it's been a display item since then, seen in this photo.
How was it returned?
It was returned, Fred, help me out. I'm assuming on rail and then eventually on truck.
Yeah, it was on, I saw it going on the highway on low bed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Staff taken off to make it lower.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks. Questions are good. Now, thanks, Fred.
You're welcome.
Here's a Climax locomotive. This is Shawnigan Lake number 2, built in 1910. Now, a Climax locomotive is a specific patented model made for steep grades, and the defining feature is that diagonal cylinder on both sides of the front of the locomotive. Now, there's 2 Climax locomotives preserved in Canada, and both of them are at the Forest Discovery Center. Now, this one, Shawnigan Lake number 2, is known by some as Old Two-Spot, and it worked from 1910 to 1929 for various companies on southern Vancouver Island. Now, the word spot is jargon for the round number plate affixed to the front of the locomotive. Okay, you can see that in this photo. So a 2-spot is a roster number 2 locomotive. Now, just like different cities have a 2nd Avenue and a 3rd Avenue, perhaps, and a 4th Avenue for street names, many different logging railway companies had a 1-spot, a 2-spot, a 3-spot. You get the idea. Now, this is all just because Port Alberni's got a famous 2-spot locomotive of their own. And sometimes people think that that's an exclusive Port Alberni nickname, but it's not. So back to Shawnigan Lake number 2, this particular old 2-spot. Now in 1929, the locomotive was stored in the camp near Deerholm, southwest of Duncan, and held as collateral in a timber rights matter. But in 1930, the Great Depression resulted in the closing of logging operations for that company, and this locomotive was left in the woods, abandoned. And then, as the years passed, nature took over and grew in around it. Try to be dramatic. Fast forward to 1969, and a Cowichan Valley resident named Granger Taylor. Now, Granger was extremely gifted in mechanical repairs and restorations. He found the locomotive, he built a road to get to it, he removed it from its 40-year forest confinement, and then at his home property, he restored it to operating condition. Now, in 1973, the locomotive was sold to the province for purposes of preserving it, and it toured BC on the Provincial Museum train between 1975 and 79. And although I was alive in those years, I sure wish I could go back in time with my camera and just enjoy the touring BC Provincial Museum train. Now, the number 2 has been at the Forest Discovery Center since 1980 and currently lives next to the gift shop inside. I stop and I see it almost every time that I'm there. And I like to read the plaque about Granger Taylor. Take a moment and think about him and his amazing work. People such as Fred have told me that he was a mechanical genius who could repair anything. And that's exactly how I think of him. Now, I've mentioned there's 2 Climax locomotives. Here's the second one. It's the Hillcrest Lumber number 9, and it lives in a locomotive shed. It was built in 1915 and worked for various logging companies on the West Coast from the 1920s and 30s. And it ended up at Hillcrest Lumber in the Cowichan Valley, starting in 1936. And after its working days were done in '68 and Hillcrest Lumber was winding down their railway operation, the Hillcrest Lumber owners, the Stone family, donated it to the Forest Museum. And it's been in the logging camp buildings and sometimes brought outside for summertime display. And back in the early 1990s, it was actually restored to operational status. Took a trip down to Sacramento, California for a steam fest. I've heard stories about that. Lots of people at the Forest Museum love to tell great stories. Here's something that looks more modern, but it's from 1928. It's a Plymouth gasoline locomotive, a cute little green thing that they call the Green Hornet. It's number 26, and you frequently see it working as it pulls the visitor train whenever the steam locomotive isn't running. Now the engine is a 350 Chev, and it sounds just like a truck. Now, it worked for 40 years for BC Electric Railway Company, mainly at Jordan River on the South Island, where they had a narrow gauge railway to get up to the power dam site there. It was purchased by the Forest Discovery Centre in 1970 as an engine for track work and a visitor train backup, doing what it's doing in that photo. And during the 2020 to 2022 era, it was the only locomotive pulling the visitor train. So when I first visited as an adult, that's what I experienced. Once again, here's something that's not a locomotive. There's a Maxwell 1-ton logging truck built in 1918, and the fellow driving it, Les, brings this out on special event days. He gives people rides around the property, and he was kind to pose it on the tracks for me. And here it is kicking up some dust on a special event day. So this is a good time to mention what I think is possibly, for some people, even for me, yes, an identity issue of whether, is this a railway museum or is this a forestry museum that has lots of railway items? Now, of course it's the latter, but it's sometimes easy to get the wrong idea depending on what you focus your time on. Now, my own interests are obviously slanted towards the railway items, and I need to pay attention, remember to pay attention to the other items. But summer weekends, when the steam locomotive is pulling the train, that's definitely a special draw for people, and I think overall, the steam locomotive is a visitor magnet to attract people into the entire center. Back to some more artifact items. On the left, in the background, we have a fire lookout tower. Now, this is a replica. It was built in 1967 for Pacific National Exhibition. So I think this is an example, the idea that museum items don't necessarily have to be genuine. They can be old replicas. And in this case, the item's from 1967. So that's 57 years ago. It's actually older than me. And I think that's a long enough period to consider it a historical artifact in its own right, even if it's not genuine, did not work out in the forest. But here's something that did work in the forest industry. On the right side, it's a ranger station building. It's used as the ranger station south of Duncan, and they moved it to the Forest Museum in 1986. Now, the building houses the museum collection of the BC Forest Service. So, it's a museum within a museum. Now, it's an iconic structure design seen from the outside, and inside, many detailed BC Forest Service items, including Smokey the Bear. Also, it's reportedly one of the cooler places temperature-wise to be on a hot summer day. So it's also become a home for non-forestry items, the whole Forest Discovery Centre, non-forestry items that enhance the general education and fun experience for visitors. It allows some items to be preserved that would otherwise be lost. So on the right side of the photo is the Westholme Post Office building, moved from nearby Westholme in 1973, and on the left side is the schoolhouse. That's the inside of the schoolhouse. It's a 1905 standard prefabricated design from the Vancouver School Board in 1985. It's a fun place for kids to visit. It's where some kids' activities happen on special event days. So let's talk about the community impact of BC Forest Discovery Centre. Now, in prior years, I've seen a tourism statistic that showed it as the #3 most visited attraction on Vancouver Island. And #1 would have been the Butchart Gardens, for good reason. That place just is excellent. And I think #2 was Royal BC Museum, and I'm not sure what the stats are now. But it is also a regular field trip location for schools in central and southern Vancouver Island, elementary and secondary. And they're educational trips. They're fun, but they're also educational trips, and they include assignment materials. Lorraine has told me this as part of their curriculum. And I attended one of those trips as a kid a long time ago. Now, the museum's connection to the Vancouver Island community I think is multi-generational. Well, it is. Parents who visited as kids are now visiting with their own adult kids. And some of these people are bringing a third generation of kids to explore. So it continues. Now, it's a regular favorite location for people to visit who just happen to have some special needs. Now, for them and their caregivers, it's a place of happy familiarity and a good, healthy location to socialize and enjoy an outing, and they love the train. And for people who enjoy the obsessive fine detail of things, it's a paradise of old artifacts and forest industry scenes, such as the steam donkeys seen in this photo. Now, the neurodivergent spectrum of people is pretty wide and diverse, and many different people enjoy the Forest Discovery Center. It's a place where they can just happily get lost in all that detail at their own pace and their own preferred level of noise and stimulation. It is a place for all types of people. Now, as for myself, well, I also enjoy the fine detail that I find there. Here, one second, I have a prop. Yeah, there are two. I don't remember anything from a 1971 visit shown in this photo because I was only 3 years old. But I got this photo that my father took, and there's a fabulous person that I'm posing with who just might happen to be in this room. It's also an interesting thing on photographs because Fred's told me that this locomotive is 24 Susie, which it says, but the window in the engineer's cab at the front is rectangular, not circular like the other ones. And so it's an example when you're dating historical photographs, you can look at little small details and know, oh, this conversion happened in this year. And I combined what Fred told me with the fact that I gathered I looked about 3, and so we came up with 1971. Made a lot of sense. Now my next trip was 1977 in grade 3 for a school field trip visit. My only vague memory of that was that they put a wooden oxen yoke on teams of us kids to pull something. But fast forward to the year 2021, and I was a 50-something self-described infrastructure history nerd. I made videos and photos as a hobby. My first visit as an adult was that summer in that pandemic era, and apparently it was obvious to staff that I was a bit of train nerd. Now, perhaps they noticed my 2 tripods and cameras and my Rocky Mountaineer train hat, but they gave me a tour of the locomotive shed, and I think I was hooked. In the following summer, I visited twice, taking more photos, making more videos. And then a friend of mine who worked there kept encouraging me to return again in 2023 when they would be running a steam locomotive. When I experienced that, I was hooked at a new level. This photo shows me at the 2023 Christmas train event. Now, I visited so many times in summer 2023, and I made so many photos and videos that they made me a volunteer the next year, essentially doing the same stuff, plus the responsibility of some special assignments. But that's let me get in early, access volunteer-only spaces in a safe, responsible way. And I've got my high visibility vest and I bought hearing protection for when I'm right close to the locomotive. And the access has been great for my hobby of making photos and videos. Now, during those summer weekends, with the steam locomotive pulling the train, I like to arrive when the locomotive crew does and observe and photograph their preparation in the shop area. This photo from August 2024 shows the crew checking out the steam whistle. There's Fred on top, pulling the trigger. The other guys being safe with their hearing. Now, it's interesting to observe the fire being lit in the locomotive, and then the steam slowly and steadily building up. It's visceral. It's the sights, the sounds, the smell. It's all wonderful. And it's like looking back to an earlier era in history, which is exactly what a working museum is supposed to do. So, I said I would start and end my talk with the stories of 2 different steam locomotives. This is the ending story. So the 2 stories are different, but they're both examples of what the Forest Discovery Center is. The first story was a locomotive that didn't work in forestry, but was a much-loved artifact in the museum. But this locomotive, number 1, seen here in April 24 of this year, undergoing trials, it's a different story. The Hillcrest #1, which is what this is a steam locomotive built in 1920 in Lima, Ohio, USA. Now, Shea is the name of a patented design of locomotive, improved and invented and improved, that's a better way of saying that, by Mr. Ephraim Shea in the late 19th century. Now, the special gear design allowed for pulling heavy loads up a steep grade, perfect for coastal logging. And it's like riding a 10-speed bicycle in first gear, if they still have those kinds of bikes. Lots of pedal motion, but really slow speed. The locomotive arrived on Vancouver Island to Hillcrest Lumber in early 1921, worked for Hillcrest in a place called Satlam, off present-day Highway 18, and then for other companies in the Cowichan Valley and Crofton, including the Osborne Bay Deep Sea Wharf, until 1963. And during its industry working years, it was a standard gauge locomotive. Hector Stone of Hillcrest donated the locomotive to the newly formed Cowichan Valley Forest Museum following conversion back to narrow gauge, the job done at Hillcrest's Massachi Lake shops. Now, it was one of the steam locomotives that pulled the visitor train in the early years of the Forest Museum, and it did this from the late 1960s to the late 1990s. And a problem with the firebox, that's beside the boiler, was the reason for the end of the working era. Now, following this, the locomotive went into storage for many years, and the visitor train was instead pulled mainly by Samson. But in the 2010s, following a few years of contemplation and planning decisions, they decided to start the rebuild project, and that was 2016. And it was completed spring 2024. That's 8 years. That's a long time, and COVID happened during this timeline. And lots of people stuck with the project through those tough times. As the project got underway, they found a lot more things needed fixing than they first thought. Not just fixing, rebuilding. Besides the boiler and the firebox. So lots of surprises, and this photo's from July 2022. That's what a locomotive looks like stripped down. It looks like there's not much there. It's the new boiler, it's the frame, below that the running gear and the pistons. Not much else.
Mike,
Yeah.
is this view from the back of the train, or is that the front of the train?
It's the front of the locomotive, so it's the front. So what would be added to it in this space here would be the smoke box and then the smokestack and the headlight, and then the cab gets added at the back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And are those parts like custom made somewhere for it?
A lot of them are machined. Fred, help me out again.
Yeah. The boiler was made at Crofton.
Yeah, the boiler, yeah. Geotech in Crofton was one of the major sponsors doing the boiler. But here's that, and then here's the same look. So we'll just toggle back. It's like, okay, what's changed? There you go. It's a bit more dressed up, and what was raw board lumber at the front is now painted, and you've got a whistle on there. So it re-entered service, pulling the visitor train on weekends, starting in June 2024. It's practically a new locomotive from the wheels up. Spring 2024 was interesting. Testing, certification, and then this. I was really happy to get this photograph. June 28th, 2024, the first passenger trip with this locomotive. That was a really fun day. Took that photo from the Forest Fire Lookout Tower, replica built for the PNE in 1967. So the Hillcrest #1 locomotive seen here is an authentic forest industry artifact. It worked many years locally in industry, and it has a long history of working at the Forest Discovery Center. Long history in tourism at this center as well as in industry. It's got an appeal to older visitors who remember riding it in that 60s to 90s era and who are now able to share it with younger generations. And kids of all ages love it because of all the moving parts and interesting sounds, and there's nothing like the sound of a Shea locomotive. Sounds like a drum pattern as it's coming up towards you. And it's got strong appeal to the North American steam enthusiast community. It's one of 5 Shea logging locomotives preserved on Vancouver Island. 3 of them are at the Forest Discovery Center. There's one in Port Alberni as well, their 2-spot, and then there's one at CATSA Museum at Lake Cowichan. At low tide, in Beaver Cove up near Port McNeil, there's part of a boiler at low tide on the beach. And in Ladysmith, under the yellow Humdurgeon log unloader machine, there's running gear that used to be part of a Shay locomotive. That's the wheels and the gears. But those are just parts and stuff. But essentially 5 full Shay locomotives preserved. It's one of 115 preserved worldwide out of 2,800 built. And it's the only one in Canada that's currently operational. So it's a big deal. It's really interesting to observe the ending years of that project. Now, a bit of promotional detail as I end. For those who are interested in visiting, the center is open 5 days a week, Thursday to Monday, from early April to late September. Now we're now in mid-September. So the last day for a regular visit is Sunday, September 22nd. So that's soon. Now there's also 2 series of special event train rides. There's Halloween, it goes over 11 nights in October, and there's Christmas season, 18 nights. There's photos from Christmas season last year. Now for those special events, the full center is not open to walk around in because it's dark, it's an evening event. And the main point is the themed train ride, plus a warm fire outside and other fun activities. But these sell out quickly online, within days, probably as fast as a Taylor Swift concert does, with the same amount of resale scams online. So, now the ticket sale timing gets announced on the center's Facebook page, likely sometime in early October for the Halloween train, and early November perhaps for the Christmas train, and you have to pay attention. But, Forest Industry, Forest Discovery Center, one of my favorite places to be. I'm happy to volunteer there, I really love it, and I'd be happy to bump into you there. So, thank you very much.
Any questions for Mike?
What's your favorite artifact at the site?
We'll say favorites, make it easier for me. I love the Shay steam locomotive that they've just done the rebuild project on, just because I've seen the end of it and I've spent so much time with it this summer, seeing it get steamed up. And then simple things, just like a walk through the forest there. I mean, again, the vision was to create it in the forest. It's very peaceful. And then they're not artifacts, but the people. Interesting people you get to meet, the volunteer base, the staff, and then regular people over and over again. And the coolest thing for me is when kids come up to me and ask me, "Are you Low-Light Mike?" and tell me that they watch my videos. That's priceless. But I like the steam locomotive. And I was biased on that one.
Just before we get the next question, can you wait until Ted gets to you with the
Sure.
mic?
Yeah.
And that way we get recorded your question as well as the response.
So who's next?
Mike, it's just
Yeah.
mainly a comment more than
Yeah.
a question. And
Yeah.
I think you probably get a kick out of this.
Yeah.
I have a family member who was involved in building the Forest Museum,
Yeah.
Jim McFarland.
Yeah. Oh, I mentioned him. Yeah.
Yeah, so to your timeline back in the
Yeah.
mid-60s,
Yeah.
Jim worked for Gerry Wellburn
Mhm.
at Shawnigan Lake Logging Division out in Deerfield.
Yeah.
And I suspect it was H.R. McMillan that urged Jim to go help Gerry.
Okay.
So Jim laid the tracks out, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And there's a family story
Yeah.
that we used to tell.
Yeah.
Jim he wanted to cut trees, to lay that line down.
Okay. Yeah.
Jerry wouldn't let him cut the trees.
Oh,
That's
wow.
why that line's kind of crooked.
Yeah. 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 I love learning stories like that. And that's another Dallas. That's another cool thing about visiting there is you hear the stories of the people. Yeah, and that's exactly what Robert Turner was saying. Is like that's very Gerry. It's lots of twists and stuff. Because yeah, interesting.
Jim is actually commemorated. There's a tree planted in his name behind the log cabin. So next time
I'll
you
look for that.
go to the Forest Museum, check it out.
That log cabin.
James and McFarland.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that memorial area down there. There's quite a few memorial plaques, and the log cabin, which now houses the model railway exhibit, is called the Wellburn Building. believe it was the original sort of museum building that housed some inside artifacts, but it's also the site, not the building, but the site that it's on, was the site of the first public building in the Cowichan Valley. It was a school and a church, used for both of those purposes in 1863, I believe. So my computer brain tells me. Thanks for sharing that.
So the tree isn't near.
Another question?
The tree isn't near the track.
This might not be quite related, but for school children coming there,
Yeah.
is there, because I don't remember, I just remember getting the little fir start,
You got a little seedling tree.
but is there a room or one of the buildings that's kind of like a teaching center or education center?
Well, you know, it so happens the curator of education is here this evening. I noticed that, I mean, Lorraine, I've mentioned to Lorraine that I noticed like there's little boxes around the forest walk where there's educational materials, which I gather when you're taking a group, she opens the box and it's like, and here's a pine cone, but tell me how to tour, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I am the education curator at the Forest Discovery Center. I've been there about 9 years. And yes, we do take children through on tours. We have two very important programs. The Forest Heritage program, which talks about the heritage, talks about the history of logging, what it was like for loggers in the Cowichan Valley back in the 40s or the 50s. We also have forest ecology, and we take children through the forest and talk about the trees, talk about the Douglas fir, talk about the red cedar. And we are completely booked up every summer, every from Easter until the children go leave school and for the summer programs. We're completely booked up for schools coming in to do education programs.
Max, welcome to you.
And one other program that we do have at Christmas time, again, it's dedicated towards school children, is it's called the Oak Christmas Tree Program. And it talks about the history of the Christmas tree. And we have that in the schoolhouse. Mike had a picture of the schoolhouse built in 1905. And so that's where all the education programs happen to go to.
Well, we went in the 1970s, so I don't know if it was as comprehensive as what you're saying. Sounds wonderful. One thing that Mike might not have thought of when he prepared the talk was that his own father and grandfather were in logging when they first were immigrants to Canada, and your own dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a family connection. we didn't rehearse this.
No.
Yeah. It's a neat place to discover things about your family history that it's like, oh, that's what my dad would have been, like the bunkhouse. I have a photo of my dad in a bunkhouse somewhere in the coastal BC area. And, yeah. Looking like he'd rather be working in the post office where he worked most of his years.
So Mike, can I ask, you talked about building of the railway, and I know there's the trellises where the railway goes over the lake. So what was the length of the original route of the track, and then I think you mentioned it's 1.6 miles or something now?
It's 1.6. It was not originally that. It was originally shorter, and the best way to describe it is the new portion goes down to the It's the southern portion that goes along the highway, makes a tight corner by the duck pond, the Ducks Unlimited pond, and then goes up past through the old farm property. Before that, and that was mid-1980s that they did that addition. So before that, it was, and now it's and as a result of that, it's currently a figure 8 loop, so it crosses over itself on a diamond interchange. And before that, it was simply just a loop, a single loop. The trestle was a Gerry idea or a Jim McFarland idea, because it was a neat thing to do. It's not needed. It's typical. Again, it's the way it ended up. The site is a typical of a logging camp in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Any more questions? So, do I see? No? Okay, here we are. Thanks, Dave.
School
Yeah.
I remember in 1968 We went to that same schoolroom from our school class. I remember grade 2. We traveled from Port Alberni, and it was a whole day trip to get to Duncan. Anyone remembers the old highway that was how long it took? 5 hours to get to Victoria from Port Alberni. Yeah. And our kids from school, we were so excited, but once we got there, everyone just wanted out of that bus because it took so long. But I remember going into this building. Yeah, not much other than that.
And there it is on the left side there.
I've been there several times, and one of the things that I remember is the rails were made of wood.
Okay.
And there are wheels there that are curved so that they wouldn't slip off the wooden railings.
Okay.
Quite
Some of those I have not seen old wooden rails there, so.
But there was a demonstration area.
A demonstration area. I mean, I think that a lot of people remember that's not out there anymore is a hand car that you pump with your hands. And that was there. They do have a little putt-putt car, like the red sort of motor car that has like a putt-putt engine, that they use that for track work.
And I've been there several times, and you really got to spend several days there. There's so much there.
Yeah.
Okay, one last call for questions. Well, with that then, thank you, Mike. I mean, as you can see from the attention of the audience, they found it a very interesting talk. And your promotion of the site is very, very suitable, because for anyone here that hasn't been there, fully recommend you going. I guess the next opportunity will be either for Halloween or for Christmas. I've done a Christmas one,
Yeah,
which is kind of fun.
You still have a couple of weeks of regular operations. The steam train's not running until it runs for the Halloween event, but yeah.
So with that, Mike, I'd like to give you as a token of our appreciation from the Society. Thank you very much for coming. And now we have refreshments, but also